Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, we're going to be talking about podcasting, but our approach, appropriately enough, will be to examine how the medium fits into a scholarly context. By doing so, we'll be asking what makes something, whether it's a book, a journal article, or even a podcast, scholarly. What mechanisms, frameworks, standards, and techniques define scholarly content, and how malleable really is this definition? In what ways can the conventions of what we consider scholarly publishing be pushed into new territories? My guests for this series have been asking these very questions as they piloted a podcast series which then grew into a much more ambitious grant-funded project called the Amplify Podcast Network that's growing a network of podcasting as a form of scholarly communication, as well as building metadata standards and tools to help integrate podcasts into institutional archives and make them much more discoverable, all while establishing them as legitimate, open educational resources. Joining me are Hannah McGregor, Assistant Professor of Publishing at Simon Fraser University. Hannah is also the creator and host of The Secret Feminist Agenda, the original pilot podcast that helped inform the development of the Amplify Podcast Network. Joining Hannah is Siobhan McMenemy, Senior Editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which has partnered with Simon Fraser University, Wilfrid Laurier University Library, and the Documentary Media Society to create and support the network. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is the sponsor of this 4-episode series of The Authority File. In this second episode, Siobhan and Hannah talk about the launch of the Secret Feminist Agenda podcast and how a customized peer review process helped its development as a vehicle for scholarly communication. So Hannah, in the last episode, we ended with a little bit of a conversation about the differences between developing Witch Please, your first podcast about Harry Potter, and the subsequent podcast, Secret Feminist Agenda, which you then began working with Siobhan on. And I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about what that was like, collaborating with Siobhan and Wilfrid Laurier University on this project, what the process was like, what were some of the advantages of that relationship, disadvantages, opportunities you may have recognized after, working on this together for a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned in the last episode, I kind of went rogue and started Secret Feminist Agenda on my own, not initially intending for that to be the podcast we worked on together. And
Right.
It was Siobhan who sort of said, actually, I think that this should be our pilot podcast and that we'll work on this one. And that meant that we had to very quickly rethink what that relationship was going to look like. Initially, I think our plan had been that I would, produce an episode. It would go to Siobhan. She would listen, give feedback. I would make edits. Then it would go for peer review. Then it would get published. Something like that sort of followed more of the traditional workflow of scholarship, even though it would obviously look different because it was a different medium. But I had just started making this podcast and I was already 4 episodes in and had committed to a weekly production schedule, which meant it was suddenly impossible for us to do any traditional approach to editorial feedback or peer review. And so what we fairly quickly established was a norm where Siobhan would listen to episodes when they came out. I would have loved to send them to her before they came out, but I often finished them midnight the day before I post them. And so she would listen to the published episode and she would still give me feedback that I could sort of then bring iteratively into future episodes and sort of think about as I kept developing the show and kept improving it over time, which I did really end up doing very much in public. Like if you go back to those early episodes, they're a little rough. They're a little rough around the edges. I was still figuring out what I was doing. And then we had to figure out how peer review was going to work because it was absolutely impossible for the episodes to be peer reviewed before they were published. And so we ended up making the decision that we would chop the podcast into seasons that had a really sort of clear demarcation around them, and that the seasons would be peer reviewed as a whole once they had been completed. And that I would then use the feedback from the whole season peer review to develop the following season. Though again, timeline ended up being tricky, and sometimes I was a few months into season 2 before the season 1 peer review came out. But nonetheless, I ended up getting these kinds of substantive and focused feedback from Siobhan on the one hand, and then from the peer reviewers on the other hand. And that was the eye-opening piece of this collaboration for me. I came into it enthused and excited and a little skeptical about how much I would appreciate peer review on my podcast, particularly because I think a lot of my peer review experiences had been the kinds of negative peer review experiences people often associate with peer review, the kind of like gatekeeping, prohibitive experiences I think some people have. And so I was wary, particularly for the first round. And what I have realized working with Siobhan and working with the press is that one of the most exciting areas of expertise that university press editors have is precisely helping to shape a peer review process that actually does what peer review is supposed to do, which is put your work in dialogue with people who understand what you are trying to accomplish and are going to help you do a better job. And that experience of having thoughtful, engaged listeners doing holistic listens to my seasons and then giving me feedback that takes up the spirit of the project and pushes me in really specific directions to improve it was frankly mind-blowing. Like nothing else I had experienced as a scholar, like nothing else I'd experienced as a podcaster. Like I was so fully convinced after that first season of peer review that there was really something exciting here. And then every subsequent season of peer review convinced me all the more that like, oh, this is a collaboration that makes sense. There's something really exciting that can happen here.
That's excellent. I'm glad you brought up the peer review component, Hannah, and because this project, to my knowledge, is unique in that it brings peer review to podcasting. And so, Siobhan, I want to pitch this over to you. You've actually laid out some reasons to bring peer review to the podcast on WLU's site. Can you talk about those reasons and just kind of walk us through the big ones?
There's a lot to be said about the peer review, and that's the major component to my contribution as I see it. And I think one of the things that was really important to Hannah initially and increasingly important and sensible from my point of view was that the peer review, first of all, should be an open one. And I guess I should back up just a bit to say that there had to be a peer review process because it's integral to the process of scholarly publishing. And this peer review experiment with the podcast was a valuable opportunity for us to engage with the questions that have arisen over the course of time that have led scholars like Hannah to feel apprehensive about peer review. And one way I had gathered from my own reading and anecdotally was that to open up peer review might then alleviate some of the anxiety that the author or podcaster feels because the anonymity of a peer reviewer allows sometimes for a shield to hide behind with some less than productive feedback or criticism that isn't really, collegially delivered necessarily.
Yep.
And open peer review then necessitates an agreement on the part of the reviewers to engage fully and constructively and productively with the creation in front of them and to allow everyone to know, particularly the creator, the scholar, to know who they are. But in this case, we upped the ante, and we also opened it to public consumption by putting the peer review online at our press website. And there were two reasons for that. One, it was naturally born of the desire to have an open peer review. And two, because part of my purpose for being involved in this project, beyond looking to see whether the involvement of a university press in podcasting made any kind of sense, was to help advocates for opening up what counts, as we've been alluding to over the course of the conversations, what counts as scholarship, what counts for tenure and promotion, what counts as a publication. And of course, university presses play a considerable role in contributing to the notions of what counts. And so I saw this as an opportunity to contribute to that discussion and to help advocate on behalf of academics who are interested in born digital scholarly productions. So that's part of what is discussed on the website and what the grant that we were operating under with the support of helped me to frame my undertakings. And it's always a pleasure to hear Hannah talk about the transformation of her attitudes toward peer review, precisely because I've been spending a career trying to hone my work on that very process of finding the right kind of people to support and to engage with an author or a podcaster's work. And one of the joys of the open peer review, in addition to the others, is that it allowed Hannah and me to discuss the kinds of people by name who she might like to see peer review the podcast. And obviously, when there's meant to be a level of confidentiality and anonymity to the peer review, I don't have the liberty of discussing who would make sense and who doesn't without being a little cagey about things. And so the openness is liberating on multiple fronts. And we did have some incredibly helpful reviews. And the reviewers were wonderful and not uniformly convinced that the press or I really needed to be involved in this. But I think it's safe to say that if you read through the 3 seasons of peer review, that in fact, the success of peer review is on display, not only for what it gave Hannah as a podcaster by way of feedback, but also for the process itself and the ability to really work collaboratively as a press editor, a podcaster, an academic, and reviewers. One reviewer was quite skeptical going in. I think the report is indicative of that. And by the end, she was tweeting that she thought, having reviewed the text of the first season's peer review online, that actually maybe she'd been wrong about the good sense of peer reviewing podcasting.
That's fantastic. Can you talk a little bit about what were some of the forms that the peer review feedback took? Right, there were, if I'm remembering correctly, there were audio interviews, there were letters. How did you receive the feedback in sort of physically?
The first season's peer review was fashioned after the conventions of monograph peer reviewing or book manuscript peer reviewing, insofar as it was written. The set of questions were written. They're online as well. But they were way more elaborate than the subsequent season's peer review questions, in part because, again, we were operating with particular research questions in mind. And so there are a lot of what I would call inside baseball questions that annoyed, frankly, the reviewers. But they nevertheless gamely entertained them and engaged with them, or mostly engaged with them. But a lot of those questions were important to me because I had to figure out, and I can't say that I have definitive answers, but I had to figure out to what extent I was going to be able to draw comparisons with more conventional book or journal academic publishing, again, for the sake of the advocacy work that I will do and am doing. Because there is a level of skepticism around foreign digital publishing from the other side. So the reviewer may have been skeptical about my involvement and peer review's place in all of this. Then there's the group of scholars and university administrators and granting agency committees who are a little wary of the Born Digital research projects. And so I had to figure out a way of translating, in a sense, what was familiar into what was unfamiliar. And so some of those first season questions were my attempt at getting at some of that. What Hannah and I decided to do, because this was going to be an iterative peer review process, was that with the second season, we would take what we learned from the reports in the first season on that on that publishing side and craft some questions that were a little less interested in those debates about, what's the same and what's different about these forms, and instead give Hannah more feedback on the content itself. But it was still going to be, listening to audio recordings, and then the reviewers would write reports, which would be uploaded to the website. And then it was with the third season's peer review that we decided to break out of that particular convention of the written report. And the reason for that was partly inspired by things that we had heard others say in peer review and respectively at our workplaces and wherever, about the fact of the audio, the podcast being an audio form and the peer review being a written form. Couldn't there be something done about that?
Right.
And so we decided we would experiment with an audio peer review for the third season's review. And it's very much in keeping with the spirit of the podcast itself, which I thought appropriate as well. Mm-hmm. So it's collaborative. So one of the conventions that I engage with book manuscripts, if there are to be multiple rounds of peer review, is to look for consistency from one round of review to the other in the readers of the manuscript. And in this case, what I decided to do was to return to one reviewer from season 1 and one reviewer from season 2 and ask them to have a conversation in response to the questions that we set for the peer review of the season. And then Hannah and I agreed we would have a conversation together to respond to those peer reviews, or to that collective peer review, which was the first time I, of course, had ever been in a position to have to respond to peer review. It was a very unnerving experience, and I am a better editor for it. Of course, I'm sympathetic to the stresses and strains of this process. I've done this work for a very long time, but to suddenly find yourself in the midst of it yourself is a very different experience, which was important for me to have. And really the form was unnerving to me, because as I think the peer reviewers found as well, because you suddenly realize that it's your voice that's going out there for people to listen to, which is not something that I'm, she said, doing a podcast, not something that I'm greatly experienced or comfortable with, but here we are.
Right. You're doing great, Siobhan.
Yeah, thank you. But the other thing is that it goes back to the comments I made in the first episode about listening and the skill that is required in taking in the audio and the ideas through a different sort of thought process, and then responding verbally to those with or without notes. And it was also a real challenge, which in the end I really enjoyed very much. And it remains to be seen whether we'll insist that be done for any subsequent podcast. But I feel, and Hannah, you can weigh in too, but I feel it was a very productive experiment.
It was extremely productive. It's still so funny to me that, we were creating this unusual form of scholarship, and then we gave peer reviewers this, like, here's a list of questions. And the peer reviewers were almost across the board were like, thanks for your structure that you're trying to make us follow. We're just going to do whatever we want. It's like, that's kind of perfect, right? Because the whole project is about challenging norms and structures. And so the people who Siobhan invited to peer review are people who are engaged in that work. And so they inevitably ended up being critical of the structure itself in a way that was productive and also, to me, hilarious.
Yeah. I will say though, there are often peer reviewers of book manuscripts who choose to ignore the questions as well.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, not to the point where I have nothing to work with, but
yeah.
There's a bit of picking and choosing going on from time to time.
I wonder, based on what you both just said, whether the structures that you've kind of ended up with do you feel like those are that you've been able to sort of templatize that to apply to future podcasts of under different subject areas and that kind of thing?
My feeling is that of uncertainty.
Yeah.
I don't know that I don't think I have. I don't think I'm there yet. Yeah. And I am actually kind of resistant now to the idea of doing that. But I also feel as though I'm still very firmly on that learning curve. And I have a lot more conversations I have to have, not only with Hannah, but with the peer reviewers who participated in this project, who have a lot to say about the question of the peer review questions.
Right.
And I don't pretend to really fully appreciate what I need to do to get to a place where the questions could possibly be standardized, let's say. I have been increasingly flexible and creative with my peer review questions for book manuscripts without feeling as though I'm somehow interfering with the need for some kind of judgment. And I think it would be naive to suggest that the peer review can be, judgment can be done away with. But it doesn't need to be hostile. It doesn't need to be damning. It doesn't need to cut off conversation. So, what I'm trying to do with the questions I ask of all of the scholarship that I'm peer reviewing are the kinds of questions that are a little more open-ended and a little more accommodating and encouraging of dialogue between the author, podcaster, and the reviewer, rather than, strict yes or no judgment kinds of questions.
You just heard from Hannah McGregor, Assistant Professor of Publishing at Simon Fraser University. Hannah is also the creator and host of The Secret Feminist Agenda. You also heard from Siobhan McMenemy, Senior Editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk more about the Amplify Podcast Network, its goals, and its plan to help make podcasting an official member of the scholarly publishing community by developing metadata standards and tools.
A lot of academics make podcasts, like a significant number of academics make podcasts, but it's incredibly difficult to find them via anything other than word of mouth.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.